The slap echoed through the cathedral before Eleanor Whitmore understood her own father had delivered it. "Smile," he hissed against her veil, "or I shall drag you down that aisle by your hair." 300 guests pretended not to see. Lord Marcus Thorne. Her bridegroom only smiled, the patient smile of a man who had already purchased the silence of every soul in that pew. She had been sold for £10,000 and a forgiven debt. Her mother wept into gloved hands and would not lift her eyes. Then the cathedral doors flew open. The Duke of Ravenscar stood in the threshold, scarred, storm-soaked, uninvited. He had not spoken her name in 5 years. He had not spoken to anyone, they said, since the fire. His dark gaze found hers across the marble. "This wedding," he said quietly, "does not happen today." And Eleanor realized, with a cold and terrible certainty, that he had been waiting for this morning her entire life. Have you ever run so hard from the life someone else picked out for you that you dove headfirst into a stranger's and prayed he was only the smaller monster? Eleanor Whitmore woke to the sound of weeping, and she knew at once which kind it was, not the proud kind. Not a mother sending a daughter off to happiness, dabbing her eyes in a doorway and meaning every tear. This was the other kind, the wet, ruined, guilty kind. The kind that seeps under a door and pools in your chest before you've even managed to open your eyes. She had been listening to that sound swell in the Whitmore house for 3 years, and she knew its every register the way a sailor knows weather, because the family had been rotting from the inside far longer than 3 years. Her father gambled, lost, then gambled harder to chase the loss down whatever hole it had rolled into. Her brother Edmund poured what little remained into ventures that collapsed the instant his hand so much as grazed them. A shipping scheme, a mine that held more water than ore, a partner who sailed for the colonies with the last of the family's good silver. The mortgage went unpaid once, then twice, then a third time, and that was the month the men at the door stopped wearing hats and started carrying something heavier under their coats, men who did not knock so much as test the hinges. And then Lord Marcus Thorne arrived, like weather, like a tide that does not argue with the shore, only rises until the shore is gone. He offered to clear every debt, the whole black mountain of it, down to the last shilling owed to the last frightening man, in exchange for one thing she had met him exactly twice before the banns were read aloud. The first time, he had studied her the way a man studies an animal at market, her teeth, her posture, the set of her hips, and whether she would carry a child to term and live through it. He had not bothered to conceal the inspection, because a man does not hide what he believes he has already purchased. The second time, he had cornered her among her father's bookshelves, pressed her spine against the spines of better men's books, and laid one cold hand around her throat. Not squeezing, merely resting there, the weight of it a kind of contract, a promise dressed as a touch, which was somehow more terrible than any blow. "Obedient wives live soft lives," he had murmured, the brandy thick and sweet on his breath. The disobedient ones learn to fear the dark. She had not slept a whole night through since that afternoon. Now the maids laced her into ivory, pulling, cinching. The corset crushed her ribs, until breathing became a thing she had to choose to do, deliberately, in the half-second between each yank of the cords. The lace at her wrists itched as though it were alive and resentful of its work. The veil came down over her face, and the whole world dimmed and softened and receded. The way a thing looks once you have already begun to mourn it. Because she had. She was attending her own funeral. They had simply dressed the corpse in white instead of black and called it a wedding. Her mother could not meet her eyes in the glass. She fussed instead at a sleeve that wanted fussing, smoothing it again and again, as if she might smooth the whole morning flat. "You look beautiful, dear." The words fell between them like a coin tossed to a beggar, genterous, useless, a small cruelty, even though her mother would have wept to hear it named, and what none of them in that room understood. Not the maids with their busy hands, not the woman weeping behind her, not the father already gone ahead to drink himself into enough courage to give her away. was that Eleanor had spent 3 years learning one single skill, the only one that would matter on this particular morning. She had learned to wait, to watch, to find the exact half-second when the men set to guard her forgot, for the length of a heartbeat, to do it. The church stood 4 blocks east. A short walk. A public one, and that too was by design, because Thorne wanted the whole of fashionable London to witness his fortune buying itself a bride in clean daylight, a procession of money, with onlookers lining the route. He did not want a wife so much as he wanted the city to see him acquire one. The way a man parades a new horse, he has no intention of letting anyone else ride. Her father was meant to walk beside her. He was not waiting at the door. He had gone ahead, naturally, because a man cannot hand off his own child while sober and still meet his face in the shaving glass the next morning. So she walked between 2 footmen instead. They were not there to honor her. They were fences that happened to have legs and faces. She understood it the instant one of them let his hand hover near her elbow, ready. The way a man keeps a hand near a gate he expects to fly open. They were halfway when the apple cart went over. She would wonder, for the rest of her life, whether some bored and overworked saint had reached down and tipped it just for her. Red fruit bouncing across the wet cobblestones, rolling under the boots of strangers. A small bright catastrophe dropped into the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Both footmen turned toward the noise, both of them. At the very same instant, the way iron turns to a lodestone. 3 seconds. That was the whole of the gift. 3 seconds, and not a breath more. Eleanor ran. The satin slippers were a joke played on her by wet stone. They slid out from beneath her, betrayed her at the first stride. So she let the gown tangle where it would and tore the veil from her face and flung it behind her, where the wind took it and lifted it like a ghost, finally cut loose from the thing it had been haunting. Behind her came shouting. Her name first, called almost politely, then snarled when the politeness proved useless. The footman had spun back to find the prize horse bolted clean out of the yard. She did not look. Looking back is the precise habit that gets the slow ones caught. She cut hard into a narrow alley, and her lungs went to fire, and her sight smeared with tears. She had no spare moment to weep, no plan. No coins sewn cleverly into a hem, the way they always were for the braver, luckier girls in stories. No destination at all, but away, 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 until the single word had become the whole of her body and the cobbles answering her feet. She would rather bleed out in a gutter under her own name, she thought, than wake even once in a featherbed under his. And then she saw it. At the dead end of the alley, drawn up tight against the cold gray flank of the church, sat a carriage, black, lacquered so deep that it drank the morning light rather than throwing any of it back. And on the door, worked in silver and a crimson the color of old blood, a crest she knew. Everyone in London knew it. A wolf's head crowned about with thorns, the mark of the Hargroves, the mark of Sebastian Hargrove, Duke of Ravenscar, the man who had come home from a foreign war with half his face ruined and a name so black that nurses used it to frighten children into their beds. And the king himself, it was whispered, chose his words with care in the man's presence. The carriage door hung open. Only a crack, as though it had been left so on purpose, as though, absurdly, it had been left open for her. She did not think. Thought is a luxury reserved for those not, at that exact moment, being hunted through the streets of a great city. She dove in headlong, hauled at the door, shut behind her, and folded herself down onto the floor between the seats. The ruined gown bunching around her, like a great wad of crumpled paper, her heart slamming so violently against the cage of the corset that she half believed it meant to crack the one rib of the laces had been kind enough to spare. Perhaps it was empty. Perhaps she could simply hide here, small and silent, until Thorne wearied of the chase, and the search rolled on down the street. And then she could slip out at dusk, and lose herself in a city that swallowed girls like her, every single day of the year, without once pausing to taste them. That was the whole of the plan. It was not much of one. But she had learned that morning that a poor plan executed without hesitation beats a fine one, a half second too late. The smell reached her before the voice did, before the fear had even finished sharpening itself into anything she could name. Expensive tobacco, rain-soaked leather, cold and rich and unmistakably the smell of a man who owned things, who was present in the dark beside her, and who had already noticed exactly what had tumbled into his carriage. She was not alone. "You're bleeding on velvet older than your family name." The terrible thing was that the voice did not startle. It was bored, mildly inconvenienced. The voice of a man who has found a stray cat curled in his study and has not yet troubled to decide whether to feed it cream or have a footman carry it to the pond. Eleanor's eyes climbed. Slowly, because some animal part of her did not want to arrive at the top. Polished black boots. Trousers, cut by a tailor who charged more for the cloth than her father had lost in a season. A coat of black velvet threaded fine with silver, the kind of garment that announces a man before he has said a word. And then, at last, the face. The rumors, she understood in that single suspended instant, had been kind, generous even, charitable. 3 scars cut down the left cheek, pale pink and jagged, running temple to jaw, as though something had begun to peel him and lost its nerve partway through the work. His eyes were dark, and still, with the particular stillness that arrives in the breath just before a thing breaks open. She began. The word cracked apart on her tongue, and was no use to anyone. "You're the Whitmore girl." The one Thorne bought this morning, not a question. He did not appear to be a man who dealt much in questions. He stated, and the world arranged itself to agree. She nodded, her voice having abandoned her entirely. "Does he know you're in here?" "No." She dragged it out from under the panic by main force. "I ran. I didn't choose your carriage. I didn't even know whose it was. The door was open, and I just—" She heard the sentence running away from her and could not catch the end of it. He let her go on, watched her drown in her own words with the calm of a man watching rain streak a window. Then, when she had quite finished, "Stop, not unkind. Only final the way a closing book is final." She stopped, "Please." She despised the word the moment it slipped free, despised how small it carved her down to. But pride is the first thing they teach a daughter raised to be sold, and she had swallowed it so many times, by now it hardly scratched on the way down. "Please don't give me back to him." He leaned into his corner and considered her, the way a man considers a problem he has not yet decided is worth the bother of solving. "And why, precisely, would I do that?" "Thorne's affairs are no concern of mine." "Then let me go. Faster now, because Osib's a reckless and ungovernable animal. Only open the door. I'll vanish. You will never once hear my name spoken in your life again. You misunderstand me." His eyes narrowed by the width of a hair. "I am not keeping you on Thorne's account. I am keeping you because you have trespassed in my carriage, and because I have made it a strict rule never to decide anything of consequence, while a frightened woman is making demands at me from the floor of it." Which would have stung, had there been a single moment to spare for the feeling, because outside, the world arrived all at once. Footsteps, many of them, slapping the wet stone. Voices fanning out across the breadth of the street, and riding above them all, one voice, sharp and patient as blade drawn slowly from a long sheath. "Check every carriage on this street. She cannot have run far in that dress. Thorne, her blood did not run cold. That is too soft a phrase for it. It seized. It locked solid in the span of one indrawn breath, and she looked up at the scarred man with the only fluency life had ever permitted her, the fluency of begging, the whole of it pouring out. Through her eyes, because her mouth had failed her again. He did not move, did not so much as shift his weight. He simply watched her, patient and clinical, as though waiting to learn precisely what a cornered creature does in the last instant before the trap shuts on it. The footsteps came nearer. A shadow slid across the tinted glass and darkened the carriage by a shade. The door handle rattled in its housing, once testing, and then he moved, far faster than a man so deliberately still had any business moving. One gloved hand closed around her wrist and lifted her bodily off the floor onto the seat beside him. Before she could shape a sound, he had stripped the heavy cloak from his own shoulders and cast it over her, swallowing her whole beneath the weight of the wool, and curled one arm across the hidden shape of her, so that any eye at the window would find only a duke seated alone, with his cloak heaped carelessly at his side. His mouth came near the place. Her ear must be. The words carried almost no breath behind them at all. He will not touch you. Be still. Don't breathe loud. The door swung wide. Cold air poured in across her hidden skin, and with it came Thorn's voice. Your Grace, careful on its polished surface, boiling somewhere beneath. Forgive the intrusion. I'm hunting for someone. A young woman, a white gown, a wedding dress. Has she come this way? I have seen a great many women this morning. The Duke's voice had gone flat as the surface of a frozen pond. The city is fairly choked with them today. This one is my bride. She's unwell, confused, not at all in her right mind. I must reach her before she does herself some lasting injury. How tragic that must be for you. Not one thread of sympathy ran through it. But as you see, I am quite alone, and already later than I would like. For an appointment, I have no intention of missing any further on your account. Closed the door, a pause. A long and dangerous one. Eleanor felt the entire morning balance itself on the thin edge of a knife and wait to see which way it would fall. If I might only just. Close the door. The cold inside that carriage dropped another full degree. He had not raised his voice, had not moved a muscle she could feel. But something coiled inside those three flat words made even Eleanor's hidden heart skip its beat, and she was the one he was sheltering. A silence stretched out. Then, slowly, with the reluctance of a man unused to retreating from anything, Thorn's boots scraped backward across the stone. The door clicked shut. Neither of them stirred. They sat together inside the dark of the cloak and the dark of the carriage, and they listened. To the hunt drifting away down the street, to the voices thinning into the ordinary roar of the city, to London resuming its vast and total indifference to the fate of one more girl. Only when the last of it had bled away into the distance did the Duke lift the cloak from her at last. Eleanor's face was wet. She had not noticed weeping. She did a great many things now without noticing she did them. Why? She managed. I don't care for Thorn. He reached up and rapped the roof of the carriage twice with his knuckles. The horses leaned into the harness, and the wheels began to turn, smooth and very nearly silent, carrying them past the place where a furious man still hunted shadows. And I have no patience whatsoever for men who run women through the streets like hounds coursing a fox. Where are we bound, you'll be wondering? Ravenscar Hall, and it was only as the spires of the city began to sink behind them that the first cold splinter of a question worked its way in under her skin and lodged there. A carriage does not park itself at the precise dead end of the precise alley a fleeing bride happens to choose, on the precise morning of her flight, with the door left precisely ajar. Luck behaved that way in stories. It had never once behaved that way in her life. She filed the thought away, where she filed everything now, and held her tongue. The ride out of the city took the better part of an hour, and she spent the most of it pressed into the far corner of the seat, watching London thin into farmland, watching grand houses rise out of the gray and fall away again behind. He did not speak. His attention stood fixed on something past the glass that she could not see, and she began to understand that this was a man who kept the larger part of himself, locked in a room she would never be invited to enter. When at last they passed through iron gates, worked with that same wolf and those same thorns, her breath caught, despite everything the day had already done to her. Ravenscar Hall rose from its grounds, like a thing raised by a man who had given up on warmth entirely and resolved to make a virtue of the cold. Gray stone that absorbed the afternoon rather than wearing it, towers standing watch at every corner, narrow windows staring down like a face that had learned, long ago, and at some cost, never to betray what moved behind it. It was beautiful the way a sea cliff is beautiful, the way the dead of winter is. You admire it, and you keep a careful distance, and you do not turn your back to it without good reason. The carriage stopped. 2 servants in dark livery reached the wheels before they had fully ceased to turn, opening the door, bowing low. The Duke stepped down first. Then he turned and offered up his hand. She hesitated, looked down at the wreck of her gown, the raw meat of her palms, her bare feet with the slippers long since lost to the chase. She must have looked like a thing the river had given back. "I can't go in like this," she said. "Everyone will see. Everyone will know exactly what everyone will see, precisely what I permit them to see." His hand stayed where it was, steady, unhurried, asking nothing. Nothing more than that. She took it and stepped down onto gravel that bit clean into her cut feet, and she flinched before she could stop herself. He did not ask. He simply bent and gathered her up into his arms as though she weighed no more than the cloak that had hidden her. She gasped and caught a fistful of his coat without meaning to. "Your Grace, I can walk. Not on those. You can't." He carried her up the broad stone steps, and his face gave away nothing of what it cost him, or did not. "Mrs. Hadley," he called into the cavern of the entrance hall, and the word came back faintly off the far stone. A severe woman in black emerged from a sud-sud-bore corridor. She took one look at the bleeding girl in the ruined wedding dress, and something behind her face shifted, giving way to something nearer to a mother's reflex. "Prepare the East Suite, draw a bath, lay out clean clothes, and send a rider for Dr. Whitfield to tend her hands and her feet. At once, Your Grace." The woman's eyes traveled over Eleanor with a brisk professional kindness that very nearly undid her. "Will the young lady be staying with us long?" "Indefinitely." He set Eleanor down in a great chair beside a fireplace built large enough for a grown man to stand upright within it. "See that she has whatever she requires, and that no one disturbs her." She woke to late gold lights slanting across an unfamiliar ceiling, and for one merciful breath she did not remember. Then all of it came back at once in the wrong order. The weeping, the apples, the wolf on the door, a scarred man telling Thorne to close it. A dress had been laid across a chair while she slept. Deep burgundy wool, plain and well cut. None of the suffocating architecture of the gown they'd buried her in that morning. She dressed slowly, every muscle protesting, her feet tender beneath bandages that had been changed without waking her. A maid came with a message. His Grace requested her company at dinner, if she felt equal to it. Her first instinct was to refuse, to bar the door, to put off the hour she would learn what this rescue was going to cost her. Because nothing in her life had ever come without a price, and the men who paid it always came to collect. But hiding had never once saved her from anything, so she went. The dining room could have seated 30. 2 places had been laid. He stood at the window with a glass of whiskey, changed now into a dark dinner jacket, and in the candlelight the scars looked older, less like wounds and more like the borders of some country he had survived. "Crossing, Miss Whitmore. I trust you slept." "I did." "Thank you." She took the seat to his right. "Your Grace, I need to understand what is happening to me. Eat first." He sat. "Then we'll talk." They ate in near silence, and she discovered she was ravenous, her body demanding fuel after the violence the day had done it. The food was extraordinary, and she scarcely tasted a bite of it. When the last plate had been cleared, he set down his glass and looked at her directly. "You want to know why I brought you here?" "The short answer is that I despise Thorne. The long one would keep us both from our beds." He turned the whiskey in the glass, watching the candle swim in it. "But you've earned a piece of the truth tonight. Thorne and I have history," he went on. "Years ago he set out to force another young woman to the altar. She had no family to stand for her, no money to run with. When I learned of it, I interfered. I was younger then, more direct. He took offense at a duke meddling in what he considered already his. The scars," she said quietly. "He hired men to teach me the cost of interference. They cornered me in an alley not unlike the one you ran through this morning. I lived. She did not. The wedding went forward without me, and 6 months later she was dead. And the physicians wrote pneumonia on the certificate because that is what they were paid to write." His jaw tightened by a fraction. "Her name was Catherine. I have spent 5 years failing to make any of it matter. What no one had told Eleanor, what she felt rather than knew, as she watched his ruined face in the candlelight, was that this man had built an entire fortress out of one old wound, and never once found the back out of it. So this is revenge, she said, against Thorn, in part. In part, it is simply practical. You need shelter. I can give it. In exchange, you'll play a role, my wife. Not in truth, not yet. In appearance. Let London believe we married in secret. Let Thorn and your family believe you found protection their hands can't reach. His voice cooled. Let the whole rotten lot of them choke on the rumor of it. You want to use me as bait. I want to give you a life in which you are not sold like a broodmare to settle a coward's debts. You stay here, you live well. You appear at my side, and you convince London that the scarred Duke has at last found someone brave enough to bear his company. And Thorn gets to watch, every day, knowing he lost you to the one man in this city who has never once been afraid of him. She studied him a long moment. One condition, a single brow rose, the truth. Always, no more half-stories, no convenient gaps. If I am to play your Duchess, I will know exactly what game I am a piece in. Something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like respect. Agreed. Then I accept. He refilled both their glasses. You are not a prisoner here, Eleanor. The library, the gardens, the grounds, they're yours. This is your home now, for as long as you choose to make it one. Thorn will come. Within the week, I'd wager. Let him. I have waited 5 years for that man to hand me a reason. He walked her back to the suite himself, the candle throwing their shadows long against the cold stone. At the door he paused, and for a moment neither of them seemed to know how the evening was meant to end. Sleep, he said at last. Tomorrow the work begins. We let the rumor loose, and after that there's no calling it back. Then he was gone, his footsteps swallowed by the long throat of the corridor. She closed the door and stood alone in the dark of the emerald room, and she found, to her own genuine astonishment, that she was not afraid. For the first time in years, perhaps in her whole life, she had something that felt less like a master and less like a savior. She had an ally. A dangerous one, by every account ever whispered, the most dangerous man in London. But dangerous for once, in her defense rather than against it. The thought was so strange she had to sit down with it. She crossed to the tall window and looked out over the black grounds. Toward the far amber glow of the city, she'd fled that morning. Somewhere out there, Thorn was already plotting his next move. Her family was drowning in fresh shame. Society had begun by now to trade the delicious rumor of a bride vanished from her own wedding. And here she stood, whole and warm, inside a stranger's fortress. Except the splinter would not leave her be. It had worked deeper while she slept. Because a carriage does not park itself at the precise dead end of the precise alley a fleeing bride happens to choose. She had told herself all evening that it was coincidence, that God or luck had simply been kind for once. But she had survived 3 years by refusing to believe in kindness she could not account for, and the habit did not switch off because the bed was soft. She pressed her palm flat to the cold glass and followed the thought all the way down, the way you press a bruise to learn how deep the hurt goes. The door, left open. The street, dead-ended against the church where her wedding was to be. The hour, exactly the hour she would flee, if she fled at all. And his words, in the dark of that carriage before she had given him a single thing. You're the Whitmore girl. The one Thorn bought this morning. Not a guess. Not a question worried over. A fact, delivered flat, the way a man recites something he has read and reread until it bored him. A door does not stand open for a stranger. It stands open for someone you have been waiting for. The cold of the glass spread up her arm and into her chest. And Eleanor understood, with the slow horror of a person, recognizing a face in the dark, that she had not stumbled into rescue at all. She had walked, on her own 2 bleeding feet, straight into the center of something's arranged long before she had ever started running. The kindness, the bath, the doctor, the careful speech about taking up space in the world. All of it sat now under a new and uglier light. She did not know yet what she was to him, but she knew, with the certainty that had kept her alive, that she was the last person in this house to learn it. And that, more than Thorn, more than the wedding, more than the men with knives at her father's door, was the thing that frightened her. She made herself a promise to the dark, the kind you can only make at night, and must then live up to in daylight. Whatever this was, whatever he was, she would not spend one more day of her life being the last to learn her own price. She would find the rest of the story herself. She would read it before anyone could decide which parts she was permitted to see. She did not sleep again that night. She lay in the great canopied bed and listened to the old house settle into its bones, ticking and groaning as the fire died. And she catalogued the questions one by one, lining them up like coins on a table she meant to spend. Why the carriage? Why her? What had passed between her father and this man before the wolf crest door had ever swung open? Somewhere beneath all of it lay an answer she would not like. And she had to sit lying there in the borrowed dark, that she would rather hold an answer she hated than a comfort she could not trust. The rumor moved faster than any carriage in England. By the second morning, the scullery maids were trading it in whispers over the wash. By the third, a footman let slip that a milliner in town had already opened a book on it and was giving generous odds. The scarred Duke, a bride in secret, a wedding, lifted clean out from under Lord Thorne's nose on the very steps of the church. London does not require the truth to raise a cathedral of scandal. It requires only a foundation, and Sebastian Hargrove had handed it stone enough to build a steeple. Eleanor watched it spread from inside the walls of Ravenscar, the way a woman watches a fire she has set on purpose, with a strange double feeling of being at once the arsonist and the kindling. She did not let herself idle. She refused it on principle. Idleness was precisely what Thorne had wanted of her, a soft ornamental thing kept waiting on a shelf for his convenience. So she walked the grounds despite the autumn cold that bit through her borrowed wool, learning the paths, the walled garden gone to seed, the dark line of woods at the property's edge. She read in the library until her eyes burned. She learned the names of the servants and used them, which baffled them at first, and then, by slow degrees, won her something she had not known to want, a softness in their faces when she passed. But under all of it, she watched. Because watching was the work now. The rest was costume. She paid attention to the household the way she had once paid attention to Thorne's moods, mapping its currents. Mrs. Hadley ran the place like a ship and clearly loved its master with the fierce silent loyalty of a woman who had seen him at his worst and stayed. The older servants moved with the ease of decades, and there was one she could not place, a footman named Croft, taken on only recently to replace a man let go, quick and quiet and forever, somewhere near the door of whatever room she happened to be thinking aloud in. He polished things that did not need polishing. He listened a beat longer than a servant ought before he moved. She noticed him the way she noticed everything now, filed him in the careful drawer she had built inside herself, and told herself it was nothing. She tried in those days to find the seam in Sebastian's kindness, the place where the lie showed. She could not. He left her entirely alone unless she sought him out. He answered her questions, when she asked them, with a directness that unsettled her more than evasion would have. He had given her a home, and asked nothing of, yet, but patience. And that was exactly the trouble. A man who wants nothing visible is a man who's wanting lives somewhere you cannot see it. She asked him once over breakfast why his carriage had been where it was that morning. He did not look up from his correspondence. Because I knew Thorne meant to marry you at that church, on that day, at that hour. It is not difficult to learn such things when one has the money to ask the right clerks. I judged you might run, given the chance. I made certain there was somewhere to run to. You judged correctly. I have spent 5 years studying that man and the women he buys. Now he did look up, and the scars caught the morning light. You are not the first to run, Eleanor. You are only the first to make it as far as my door. It was honest. It was even, in its way, kind. And it answered everything except the question that mattered. which was why a duke who could have 100 women rescued anonymously had chosen to be sitting in the carriage himself, waiting, on the off chance that this particular bride would choose this particular alley. That answer he did not give, and she did not yet know how to ask for it, without showing him exactly how much she had already guessed. So she let it lie, and she watched, and she waited for the week to bring Thorn to the door, as Sebastian had promised it would. He came on the 4th day. Eleanor was in the library when the front of the house erupted. Boots on marble, voices climbing over one another, and beneath the chaos, low and even and terrible, Sebastian's voice, cutting through it the way a keel parts water. She set down her book and went to the doorway. She did not hide. Thorn stood in the great hall, flanked by 2 men whose coats did a poor job of disguising what they were built to do. He was dressed beautifully, as always, but his eyes had gone wild at the edges, the look of a man whose purchase has been carried off, before he could so much as unwrap it. Where is she? Sebastian came down the staircase without hurry, each footfall landing like a verdict read aloud. You'll need to be a great deal more specific. I employ a number of women. Several of them are paid expressly to remove men who arrive without invitation. Don't insult me. The whole city is choking on it. You took her from the church steps. I took nothing. A woman sought refuge and I granted it. What occurs beneath this roof has never once been your concern. She was mine. Thorn's voice split down the middle. The contract was signed. The debt settled. She belongs to me. Belonged. Sebastian reached the foot of the stairs and set himself between Thorn and the rest of the house like a door-grown legs. You'll want to learn the past tense of that word. The lady's circumstances have altered considerably. This is abduction. Theft. I will bring the law down on you, will you? Something close to pleasure stirred under the flatness. Please do. I can imagine no greater entertainment than a public trial, the testimony alone. A courtroom of your peers made to ask aloud why a bride flung herself on a stranger's mercy, rather than pass one night in your bed. Bring your charges, Thorn. I will pay for the front bench myself. Thorn's face went the color of old wine. You have no right. I have every right. Miss Whitmore is under my protection. As my wife, the words dropped into the hall like a chandelier cut loose from its chain. Eleanor's breath stopped. They had agreed to this. She had known it was coming. But to hear it spoken aloud, made real, made witnessed by a houseful of servants, was another thing and entirely. Thorn laughed, ugly and disbelieving. You, the Duke who hasn't touched a woman in 5 years, wed to a runaway. You expect a single soul to credit it. I expect you to leave my house. And here was the part Eleanor had not rehearsed. She stepped out of the doorway into the open. Both men turned. Thorn's eyes found her, raked over her, the burgundy wool, the healed hands, the chin held level instead of bowed. She watched him try to lay this woman over the one he had cornered in a library, and fail. He's telling the truth, Marcus, she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her more than it surprised either of them. You'll regret this, he said to her, the hired men shifting at his back. When he tires of you, when he turns you into the street with nothing to your name, you'll come crawling back and I will not be there to catch you. Good, Eleanor said. I would rather starve in gutter on my own 2 feet than kneel in your house the rest of my life. She let the rest come slow, because she had earned every word of it. You taught me to fear the dark, Marcus. You never once imagined I would learn to see in it. For a moment she thought he would lunge. His weight tipped forward onto the balls of his feet. But Sebastian's men had drifted from the shadows with their hands resting at their hips, and Thorn was many things. But he was not a man who fought a fight he could not first buy his way out of. This isn't finished, he spat. No. Sebastian agreed. It has barely started. Get out before I have you carried out. The door slammed, and the hall rang with the sudden absence of him, and Eleanor realized she was shaking, not with fear, but with something far hotter that she had no name for, because she had never before been permitted to feel it. The heat of that small victory did not survive the week, because 2 days after Thorn stormed out, Eleanor went hunting through the library for a volume. Sebastian had mentioned over breakfast. A history of some foreign campaign he'd spoken of, with the flatness he reserved for things that had hurt him. She climbed the rolling ladder, ran her finger along the high shelf, and behind a heavy cloth-bound book, wedged flat against the cold wall where no idle hand would ever brush it, she found a leather folder gone soft and dark with age. She should have left it. She knew that even as her fingers closed around it. Some doors, once you open them, will not consent to shut again. She opened it low on agreements, contracts, page after page dense, with figures that made her stomach pitch and roll. And there, near the middle, in her father's unmistakable shaking hand, a debt notice dated 3 years past. The sum written at the foot of it could have bought the entire street she'd grown up on, twice over, with coin left for the horses, secured against the Whitmore estate. And lo also, in a clerk's careful copperplate, a clause she read 3 times before it would hold its shape, repayable in coin, or by marital alliance. Eleanor sat down in the nearest chair because her legs had stopped consulting her about such matters. 3 years. He had owned them for 3 years. Owned her father's ruin, her mother's nightly weeping, the knives testing the hinges of their door, the whole slow drowning of the family. The open carriage had not been luck. It had not even been mercy. It had been arithmetic. A man does not leave a door ajar at the dead end of an alley unless he already knows the name of the person he expects to come through it. She had not been rescued. She had been collected. She had traded one owner for another, and the only difference between them was that this one had been courteous about the chain, had dressed it in emerald silk, and warm baths and fine speeches about breathing freely, and she had nearly been fool enough to be grateful. The library door opened. "I thought you might care to ride out to the eastern." Sebastian stopped. His gaze dropped to the folder open in her lap, to the loose pages fanned across the floor, where her numb fingers had let them fall, and something shuddered behind his face quickly. Before the familiar stillness closed over it, the way water closes over a dropped stone. "You weren't meant to find those," he said quietly. "No." She stood and her voice did not shake, which felt like a small private miracle granted to her by some saint who owed her one. "I don't imagine I was." "How long, Sebastian? How long have you owned my family?" The fire breathed in the grate. He did not look away from her, and she gave him credit for that much. Later, when she could bear to give him credit for anything. 3 years, he said. "Your father came to me. Drowning, the creditors at his door were not men who send letters." His hands hung open at his sides, and she would think about that too, much later, that he did not reach for her, or for the papers. "I never asked him to invoke that clause. I never intended to. But the day I learned he meant to sell you to Thorne instead. I made certain my carriage would be exactly where you would need it. You arranged all of it." The betrayal climbed up through her chest like cold seawater, filling a whole ship, slow and total, and impossible to bail. The rescue. This house. The kindness. Every word of it was a man collecting what he'd already bought, dressed up as a man saving a stranger. "And I thanked you. I thanked you for it." He did not deny it. That was the worst part. He simply stood there in the ruin of her trust, holding nothing, saying nothing, and let her see exactly how far down the deception went, which she would only understand much later. Was the first honest thing he had done since the carriage door swung open. Batch 3, Section 11's 15. "Say something," she said, when she could not bear his silence another moment. "You owe me that much. You owe me words." "If I had wanted to collect a debt," he said at last, slow and rough, "I would have arrived at your father's door with these papers and a magistrate and taken the house out from under all of you. I did not. I waited 3 years to see what you would do when the moment came, whether you'd run or let them lead you up the aisle like a lamb who'd stopped struggling. You ran, Eleanor. I only made certain there was somewhere on the other side of that alley for you to land. And the papers." She lifted the folder, and now her hands did betray her trembling, though her voice held. Why keep them? Why hide them like a relic if they meant nothing? Why not burn them 3 years ago, if you're the man you're telling me you are." He was quiet long enough that she heard the clock in the hall. "Because I am a coward," he said. "Because some small ruined part of me needed proof that you were meant to be here, even when the only proof I owned was the wrong kind. Even when keeping it made me the very thing I'd told myself I was rescuing you from." He looked at the folder, not at her. "That was mine to carry. It was never yours before. I let you pay for it anyway, with your trust, these past days. That is the truth, and you asked for the truth always. So there it is." She stared at him. And for the first time, the cold reputation, the flat voice, the carved and frightening face, all of it fell away. And what stood in front of her was a man who had built a fortress out of a single old wound, and could not, for the life of him, find the door back out. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. He did not argue. He did not plead his case, or reach for her hand, or offer the comfortable lie that would have closed the wound over without cleaning it. He crossed instead to the fireplace, gathered every loose page from the floor and from her slack hands, squared them once against his palm, as though even now he could not quite let go without ceremony, and fed the entire folder into the flames. "Believe this," he said, watching the paper blacken and curl and turn to feathers of ash. "You are free, completely. There is no longer any document on this earth that binds you to me or to your father's debts. If you wish to leave Ravenscar tonight, I will give you coin, a name to travel under, a letter of character to anywhere on the map. If you wish to stay, you stay as my equal, never again as a debt I have chosen not to call. The choice is yours. It always was. Now there is nothing left for either of us to pretend it wasn't." The papers were gone. The only legal thread that had ever tied her to anyone had simply ceased to be. And she had watched it go. And Eleanor, watching the last of it lift up the flue, understood two things at once, and they would not agree with one another. She believed him, and she could not stay, because a cage with a kinder lock is still a cage, and she had spent her whole life being passed hand to hand, traded and bargained over and rescued, and not once, not a single time, had she walked anywhere with nothing at all pulling her there. She did not know who she was without a debt around her neck. She was 22 years old, and she had never once been given the chance to find out. "You said I could go," she said. Something flickered in his eyes. He had not expected it. "I did. Then I am going, not because I disbelieve you, because I do, and because I have never in my life walked out of a door that another person did not first open for me." She had braced for him to talk her out of it. He had the means to. One word about Thorn, about the danger waiting beyond his gates, about a woman alone in a city that ate such women alive, and she might have wavered. She wanted, traitorously, to be talked out of it. He said none of it. "There is a widow in Camden," he said instead, after a silence in which he seemed to fight and lose some private war. "A Mrs. Lowell. She takes in sewing and asks no questions of the women who do it for her. I'll write you a character under another name. When you wish to come back, you come back through the front gate, and no one will say a word about where you've been. And if you never do," his jaw worked once, hard, "then you were never mine to keep. And I knew that the morning I opened the door, she left at first light, with a single bag and a false name stitched into her own conscience, like a label on the inside of a collar. Ellen Carter, a parson's widow fallen on hard times. No people, no history worth the asking. She did not look back at the gray towers. She was afraid that if she did, she would lose the only thing she now owned outright, which was her nerve. The room above Mrs. Lowell's shop was cold and narrow, and smelled of tallow and raw wool, and Eleanor had never in her life been so frightened, or so awake. The first sheathing to strangers' Sree's footsteps on the stair, and a city that did not know or care that she existed, and she felt the terror of it, and underneath the terror, very small and very fierce, something that took her a while to recognize as joy. She sewed. Her fingers, soft from a lifetime of being waited upon, blistered and split, and then, over the slow weeks, hardened into something useful. She earned coppers, and counted them twice and bought her own bread with them, and the first loaf she paid for with money no man had given her. She carried up to the cold room and ate sitting on the floor by the window. And she wept, and she could not have told a living soul whether it was grief or triumph, because by then the two had grown so close together she could no longer find the seam. Freedom, since she discovered, did not taste like the wine at Ravenscar. It tasted like bread she'd bought herself, and it was the finest thing that had ever passed her lips. Mrs. Lowell asked nothing, as promised, but she watched, the way women who have survived their own husbands learn to watch, and one evening over the mending she said, without looking up from her needle, "You hold yourself like a lady who's decided to forget she's won. It's no business of mine. But I'll say this. The ones who run usually run to something or away from something. You're the first I've met who seems to be running toward herself." Then she bit her thread and said no more about it. It was the truest thing anyone had said to Eleanor in years, and she carried it up the stairs and turned it over. Half the night, but Eleanor had not come to Camden only to hide and stitch and learn the weight of a copper coin. She had made a promise to the dark in an emerald room that she would not be the last to learn her own story. And there were two holes in that story she could not stop probing with her tongue, the way you cannot leave alone the gap where a tooth has been. The first was her father. Sebastian had said he offered the gentler terms, time, a clause that need never be invoked, a slower ruin than the one Thorn dealt. So why? Why would a drowning man reach past the kinder hand for the crueler one? The arithmetic did not close, and Eleanor had learned, blister by blister, that an account which does not balance is hiding a theft somewhere in its columns. She wrote to her mother, not as Eleanor and not by the ordinary post, which her father's eyes might fall across. She wrote 3 careful lines and signed them with the name of a childhood pet, a thing only her mother would know, and she addressed it to a neighbor she trusted to pass it along unread. Then she waited, and waiting was its own kind of labor. The answer came after 11 days. The paper smudged with what might have been rain and might have been something else. It was worse than she had let herself imagine. Her father had not chosen Thorn because Thorn's offer was the better bargain. Thorn's offer was crueler in every single line, the interest steeper, the terms more binding, the man himself a known horror. Her father had chosen Thorn because Thorn had done the one thing Sebastian Hargrove had refused to do. He had paid the man directly. A second purse, coin pressed into her father's own hand, over and above the cleared debt. The private price of delivering his daughter, willing and unwarned, to the altar. Of making certain she went up the aisle, believing she had no choice in it. Her father had not been forced to sell her. He had been bribed to, and he had taken the money, and stood by while her mother laced her into white, and gone ahead to the church to drink. Because a man cannot look directly at the thing he has done and still hold the cup steady. Eleanor read the letter twice through. Then she sat very still for a long time in the cold room, and something inside her that had still, against all evidence, been a daughter, some last small soft chamber that had wanted to believe, it was all desperation, and never once greed, quietly closed its door and bolted it from the inside. She did not weep over it. She had spent her tears on the bread, on the freedom, on the strange new ache of being no one's anything. For her father, she found she had only a kind of cold, clean clarity, the feeling of a window thrown open in a room that had been shut up too long. She understood, sitting there, that the cage she had been born into had never had only one door, or only one keeper. Thorn had wanted to own her, but it was her own father who had sold her, knowingly. For a purse he could carry in one fist, and that was a wound no scarred duke had inflicted, and no burning of papers could close. The men who had failed her were not all monsters with reputations. Some of them had sat at her own table, and called her his girl, and meant nothing by it but the price she might fetch. It changed something in how she thought about Sebastian, too, though she would not have admitted it to him yet. Because for all his arranging and his hidden folder and his 3 years of silent ownership, he had refused the one thing her own father had reached out and taken. He had not paid to have her delivered ignorant. He had, in his cold and crooked way, left the door open and let her choose to run through it. The distinction was not nothing. In the economy she had grown up in, the distinction was nearly everything. She folded her mother's letter small and tucked it into the lining of her bag, beside the false name and the few coins she'd saved. Then she went back to her mending, because the rent on the cold room would not pay itself, and because she had discovered that work was the only thing that kept the cold clarity from curdling into something that would eat her alive. But the second hole in the story still gaped. The dead girl, Catherine, the one before her, whose death had carved 3 lines into a duke's face and a wound into his life that never knit clean. Sebastian had given her the certificate's lie and his own certainty, and nothing whatsoever in between. And Eleanor was learning that everyone new is not the same as anyone can prove, and that the whole world ran on what you could lay on a table and make a man look at. So she did the thing no one had bothered to do in 5 years. She did not ask the Duke. She did not ask society, which knew only how to whisper behind its fans. She went looking for the people who had stood in the rooms where it happened. It took the better part of 3 weeks, worked in the hours her needle could spare. A laundress led her to a former cook. The cook, suspicious and tight-lipped and owed wages she'd never see, gave up a name at last in exchange for a winter coat Eleanor mended for nothing and a promise she meant to keep. Agnes Pruett, Catherine Ellis's own lady's maid, the woman who had dressed her every morning of her short marriage and undressed her every night of it, including the last. She found Agnes in a tenement near the river, half blind, now, flinching at every footstep on the stair, a woman aged a decade past her years by the carrying of something too heavy to set down. Agnes did not want to talk. She had spent 5 years not talking, and the not talking had bent her like a tree grown against a wall. But Eleanor did not come as a duke's emissary or a clerk of the court. She came as a woman who had run from the same man down the same kind of street. And she said so, plainly, and she rolled back her own sleeve and showed the faint marks where a wedding corset had bitten too deep into her ribs. And something in the old woman gave way like a dam that had held too long. He killed her by inches, Agnes said, her voice a dry hinge, not all at once. That would have been a mercy, and he hadn't any to spare. First, he took her friends, then her letters. Then he'd lay his hands round her throat at the dinner table and let go that second before. Every single night, so she'd lie awake, counting toward the next one. She fixed her milky eyes on Eleanor. The bruises round her neck the week she died weren't put there by any fever, miss. I dressed that body. I know what I washed. Why did you never speak? To who? He owns the magistrates. The certificate said exactly what he paid for it to say. A maid's word against a lord's is no word at all. It's a noose she ties herself. Agnes's hands twisted in her apron. But my lady knew, toward the end. She knew what was come for her, and she was no fool. She wrote it down. Eleanor's pulse went very still and very loud at once. Wrote what down? Everything he did to her, dated, in her own hand. She made me hide it the week before she passed, and made me swear that if ever I found a soul with the spine to use it, I'd put it in their hands and run. Agnes rose, pried up a loose board beneath the window, and drew out a flat oilcloth packet that had waited 5 years in the dark for a spine to come and claim it. I've been too afraid to be that soul, all this while. Told myself there'd never be one, but you've got the look of it about you. God help you, you've got the look. Eleanor took the packet. Her hands did not shake. That was the moment she noticed, with a kind of distant wonder, that they had stopped shaking somewhere in the last weeks, without her ever seeing it happen. The trembling she had carried slumily since the library worn smooth by blistered fingers, and bought bread and cold clarity. She read the first line by the gray light off the river. If you are reading this, then I was right to be afraid. Be braver than I was. Finish what I could not. And Eleanor Whitmore, Parson's widow of Camden, sewer of other women's hems, understood that she had not run from her old life into a new one at all. She had run in a great circle, all the way back to a fight that had been waiting for her, that bore her own name now, as surely as it had ever borne Catherine's. She returned to Ravenscar on a gray Thursday, at the same hour she had first arrived, except that this time she had hired the cart herself, paid the driver with her own coin, and given no one a name to expect at the gate. Mrs. Hadley opened the door, made a small broken sound she immediately tried to swallow, and did not curtsy. She took Eleanor's cold, hardened hands in both of hers, which was not a thing housekeepers did, and Eleanor would remember it long after she had forgotten grandeur or welcomes. Sebastian was in his study. He stood when she came in. He did not move toward her. He had learned, perhaps, in the weeks of her absence, not to reach for a thing that has to arrive on its own legs or not at all. "You came back," he said carefully, as though the words themselves might startle her out the door again. "I did. Why?" She set the oilcloth packet on the desk between them. "Because I found what you've hunted for 5 years. And because I am not here to be saved, Sebastian. I came back to collect a debt of my own." He looked at the packet. He looked at her face, leaner now and harder and entirely more her own than the one he had carried up his steps. And whatever he saw made him sit down slowly, like a man whose knees had stopped trusting the floor. "Catherine's hand," he said. He did not need to open it to know. Her maid kept it. 5 years, under a floorboard waiting for someone willing to use it. Everything he did, dated, in her own words. "It isn't enough to hang him on its own." Eleanor pressed her blistered fingertips flat to the desk. "But it's a thread, and I have learned, this past month, how to pull a thread until the whole garment comes apart." For a moment the Duke of Ravenscar, the man all London feared, could not find his voice. When it came, it had gone somewhere she had never heard it go before. "I spent 5 years buying clerks and bribing footmen, and chasing his money across half the ledgers of Europe. I never once thought to simply ask the woman who laundered her sheets." He looked up. "You did in 3 weeks what I failed at in 5 years, because you went looking for a man's crimes," she said. "I went looking for a woman's truth. They are not filed in the same drawer." And that was the moment something shifted between them for good. Not romance, not yet. Nothing so simple or so easily named. Something cleaner. He came round the desk and stood before her and held out his hand, formal and steady, the same way he had at the carriage door a lifetime ago. "Partners then," he said, "not protector and protected, not debt and debtor. 2 people who want the same man ruined, working as equals, with neither one owing the other a thing." She took his hand. His grip was warm, which still surprised her every time, against everything the rumors and the scars had promised. "Partners," she said. They built it that night by the fire. The grandest ball of the season fell within the fortnight, hosted by the Earl of Sy, and half of London would mask its face and crowd his floor. Thorne would be among them. His pride would drag him there on a leash, because a man like that cannot bear to be absent from any stage large enough to be seen losing on. "We let them all see us," Eleanor said. "Married. Whole, unbroken. We let Thorne watch. And we wound his pride in public, because he never strikes when he's winning. He strikes when he's been shamed in front of people who matter. Wound it deep enough, and he'll do something witless in a room full of witnesses he can't all buy at once." What she did not say aloud, what she only watched, was the footman Croft, lingering as ever a beat too long near the study door before he carried off a tray that had not needed carrying. She marked it, and filed it, and a plan began to take hidden shape behind the first one. Batch 4, Section 1620 Funkate. The plan had 2 faces, and only she and Sebastian knew the second one, because Eleanor had not forgotten the footman who polished clean banisters and listened a beat too long. So in the days before the ball, she set a small test of her own. She let Croft overhear them planning, but not the true plan, a version of it with the truth filed carefully off. A counterfeit close enough to pass at a glance and wrong in every way that mattered. In the false plan, they would confront Thorne early, in the receiving line, before the dancing, with nothing but the Duke's ledgers as their weapon. If Croft was loyal, no harm came of it. If Croft belonged to Thorne, then Thorne would arrive at the Earl of Sy's ball, braced for a blow they had no intention of throwing, armored against the wrong attack entirely, and blind to the real one until it was already on him. "You're certain?" Sebastian had asked, watching her lay it out by the fire. "I'm certain. A man who polishes a banister that's already gleaming has something other than the banister on his mind." She'd answered. "And I'm certain Marcus Thorne hasn't been surprised by anyone in years. He's grown fat on knowing things before other people mean him to. So let's feed him something to know. Let's let him feel clever right up until the floor opens under him." She chose the gown herself, not Mrs. Hadley, not a modiste-handed instructions. Her, deep emerald silk, cut clean and close, none of the suffocating scaffolding they had buried her in on her wedding morning. A mask of silver thread set with small green stones that caught the candlelight and surrendered nothing. She stood before the long glass and did not see a sold daughter, or a runaway bride, or a parson's widow stitching hems by tallow light. She saw a woman who intended to walk into a room on purpose and stay exactly as long as she chose to Catherine Ellis's letter. She did not leave behind in any drawer or strongbox. She had it sewn flat into the lining of her bodice, against her own ribs, where she could feel the stiff edge of it with each breath she took. A dead woman's truth riding into the fight at last, carried by a living one who had no intention of laying it down until a courtroom had read every word. "If it goes wrong," Sebastian said, as the carriage was brought round, and for once the flatness had thinned and she could hear the man beneath it. "If we are separated in that crush, you do not wait for me. You do not look for me. You get yourself out and you get that letter to the watch, and you let me deal with whatever's left. Promise me that." "I promise I'll get the letter out," she said. "I won't promise us not to look for you. I've spent my whole life being told to save myself by leaving someone behind. I find I'd rather not anymore." He looked at her a long moment, and something moved across his ruined face that had no name and needed none. Then he handed her up into the carriage, and they rode out into the cold, glittering throat of the night toward Cy House and everything waiting in it. Cy House blazed with 1,000 candles, and the ballroom swallowed them whole the instant they crossed the threshold. And then, all at once, the great room went quiet. 100 masked faces turned toward the doors. The musicians stumbled half a beat before recovering themselves. The whispers began like wind moving through dry grass, low and everywhere, and impossible to trace back to any single mouth. The scarred Duke. And her, the bride who had vanished from one wedding and surfaced as a duchess at another man's side. Sebastian offered his arm. Eleanor took it, and they walked into the center of the floor, as though the silence were a carpet rolled out for them, alone. "Half the room is scandalized," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "And the other half, wondering what's wrong with themselves, that they aren't us, they danced first." He led her through it with an ease that surprised her every time. This man built for stillness, moving as though he had been made for exactly this, and merely forgotten it for 5 years. She held her chin level. She met the eyes behind the masks instead of dropping hers. And turn by turn, she felt the temperature of the room begin to change around them. She was not, she realized, a scandal to be pitied. She was a mystery the whole room wanted to solve. The new duchess who had walked up to the monster everyone feared and found a man worth marrying. The whisper sweetened on every tongue that carried it. "He's here," Sebastian said, mid-turn, by the long windows. "Working very hard to pretend you don't exist." She did not look. "Then he's already losing. A man who has to perform not seeing you has spent his whole evening seeing nothing else. They worked the floor for an hour." She played her part better than she had dared hope, deflecting the prying questions with a smile that gave Ning away. Charming, an old Viscountess, who had arrived armored to disapprove and left half in love. And under all of it, she watched, because the dancing was the costume and the watching was the work. It was deep in the second hour that she caught the first thread coming loose, that she caught the first thread raking glasses. Ashix of Terikota kept glancing toward a side door. Not the practiced glance of a man minding his station, the hunted glance of a man waiting on a signal. By the balcony, another, whose livery ran a half shade off the say green. Close but not exact. the way a forged signature is close, and a third, drifting steadily nearer to wherever she and Sebastian happened to stand, far too interested in a tray he never set down. 3 of them, she breathed. Not Sayes men. The coats are wrong. Thorns brought players in costume. Sebastian's whole bearing sharpened by a degree. His eyes swept the places hers had already been. An ambush. He means to take us somewhere private, or separate us. Get me alone in the crush. She felt the letter's edge press her ribs. The balcony, most likely, away from the witnesses that keep us safe, so we don't give him a quiet corner. We stay where the candlelight and the great names are thickest. But even as she said it, she understood that Thorn had never planned to wait for a quiet corner. He had planned to make one, out of whatever he had to break to do it. As they turned toward the crowded heart of the room, one of the false servants let a full tray fall. Crystal burst across the marble in a bright shattering arc, and every head in the ballroom snapped toward the noise. Into that single-bought second of distraction, Lord Marcus Thorn stepped directly into their path. He came flanked this time, not by hired muscle, but by 2 genuine officials of the Earl's household, men with the borrowed weight of the law's good opinion at their backs. "Your Grace," Thorn said loud, pitched for the gathering audience. "Duchess, how fortunate. I was only just sharing with these gentlemen the curious circumstances of your marriage." Sebastian's hand found the small of her back. "Move, Thorn. I am merely concerned for the lady's welfare. You see, there are troubling rumors abroad that the Duke coerced poor Miss Whitmore, that he held her family's debts in his fist, and used them to force her into his bed under threat of utter ruin. His smile was a beautiful, poisoned thing. I have brought documentation, gentlemen, proof that this man owned the Whitmore family's entire future at the very hour of her supposed wedding. The timing is rather damning, is it not? A penniless girl flees one match and lands. That very morning, in the carriage of the man who holds her father's debts, the crowd's murmur shifted pitch. Eleanor watched friendly masks tilt toward doubt. This was the blow Croft had carried to him, she realized, with a cold thrill. The early confrontation, the ledgers, the legitimacy of the marriage attacked head on. He had braced for it. He had come armored against the counterfeit, and the counterfeit was all he knew. "Those documents were burned," Sebastian said, his voice gone to ice, "the debt forgiven. Weeks ago. How very convenient. Burned, forgiven, and no witness to this generous moment, I imagine, but the lady herself, who is hardly impartial." Thorn spread his hands in the room, building, brushstroke by brushstroke, the portrait of an unstable woman led astray. "My dear, no one blames you. We all know the Duke's persuasive methods. You needn't be afraid any longer. I have come to help you." The doubt thickened. Another moment and the officials would feel bound to act, to separate her from Sebastian for her own protection. And once she stood alone in a side room with Thorn's costumed men at every door, the trap would close exactly as he'd built it to. So Eleanor stopped being protected. She stepped out from behind Sebastian's hand into the open, and the whole ballroom seemed to lean toward her at once. "You're right, Lord Thorn," she said, clear and carrying. "There was a debt. The Duke did hold it, and he burned it at my asking and forgave it, and I am the witness, and I will swear to it under any oath you care to name." At his orders, more likely, Thorn said, gentle, sorrowful, painting the madwoman in real time. "You poor creature, you don't even see how he's. The only man who ever gave me orders," Eleanor cut across him, and her voice did not so much as tremble, "was you. You told me precisely what would happen if I disobeyed. You put your hand on my throat in my father's library and called it a promise. The Duke gave me a choice. You never once did. So let us not pretend before all these good people that you have ever in your life been concerned for a woman's welfare." The murmur turned, and this time it had teeth in it. "This is hysteria," Thorn said, the gentleness fraying. "Your Grace, you can all see the woman is unwell, can they?" Eleanor turned slowly to the ringed and masked faces, and she reached for the one weapon in that room Thorn could neither buy nor bribe nor burn. "You all know the stories. You trade them at every table in this city, So let me ask aloud the question none of you has dared. How did Lord Thorne's first wife die? Catherine Ellis, 6 months a bride. Pneumonia, the certificate said. She let it land in the silence. Does anyone here truly believe that? Or have we all simply found it more comfortable never to ask? The hush that followed was a different breed of hush. The kind that arrives just before a verdict. Thorne's face went the gray of cold ash. You have no proof of anything. Slander, pure slander. And I will see you, don't I? And here Eleanor reached up and drew from the lining of her bodice, from against her own ribs, the oilcloth packet that had waited 5 years for a spine to carry it into the light. She knew what you were. She knew what was coming for her. And unlike every soul in this room, she was brave enough to write it down, dated, detailed, in her own hand. Shall I read it aloud, Marcus? Shall I read the part about the bruises she learned to count by, lying awake at night? Thorne lunged for the packet. He did not reach it. Sebastian was already there, and so were 2 of Sayé's true men, drawn by the spectacle, and Thorne caught himself a hand's breadth from open assault before the entire peerage. You think a dead girl's ramblings will stand against me, he hissed, low, only for the 3 of them now. I own the magistrates. I own the certificate. I own. You owned a footman named Croft, Eleanor said softly. I know. I chose every word he carried you. It struck him like a fist to the chest. She watched the arithmetic happen behind his eyes, the plan he'd armored himself against, the blow he'd braced for, all of it a costume she had cut and stitched to his exact measurements. She watched Marcus Thorne understand, for the first time in his life, that he had walked into a room hunting a frightened girl and found instead the architect of the trap he was already standing in. So he did the only thing a man like that has left when cleverness has failed him. He reached for chaos. Smoke began to crawl beneath the balcony doors. Thin at first, a gray feeler, then a billow, then somewhere a woman shrieked fire, and the word went through that crowded ballroom like a struck match through dry tinder. The plan beneath the plan had carried its own plan, it seemed. If Thorne could not dissolve the marriage in front of witnesses, he would burn the night down around all of them and use the panic to take by force what the law and the truth had just denied him. The crowd broke. 200 elegant bodies surged toward every exit at once, masks knocked loose and trampled, silk tearing the whole glittering evening, dissolving in an instant into a single animal instinct. Sebastian seized her hand. Stay with me. But a stampede of panicked aristocrats does not care whose hand holds whose. The current took her, tore his grip from hers in 3 heartbeats. She saw his scarred face turn, searching the chaos for her, and then a shoulder drove between them, and the crowd swept her sideways toward the balcony doors, toward the exact corner she had warned him of an hour before. Hands closed on her from behind. Strong. Practiced. A palm clamped hard over her mouth before she could scream, and she smelled cheap pomade and felt herself dragged backward through a service door, into a narrow corridor where the roar of the ballroom dropped to a muffle. One of Thorne's costumed men, hauling her away from the crowd that had kept her safe, toward whatever quiet ending his master had purchased. Eleanor did not panic. That was the gift Camden had given her, sharpened on a dead girl's letter. Panic was a luxury for women who had not already lost everything once and rebuilt themselves from the bare studs. She bit down on the hand across her mouth until she tasted iron. The man cursed, his grip loosening a fraction, and a fraction had always been all she needed in her life. She wrenched free, drove her elbow back into something soft that folded, and ran blind, upstairs, with her gown gathered in both fists and the letter still pressed flat and safe against her ribs, because she would have burned with it before she let it fall into his hands. Behind her, boots. More than one set. He had not sent a single man. She burst through a door at the top into a private study, slammed it, turned the key, and spun to find another way out and found none. One window, 3 stories up, and the room already going hazy at its edges as the fire found its way through the old house's bones. The door shuddered. Wood split along the line of the lock. She went to the window, looked down, and the long drop yawned up to meet her, and her stomach turned over on itself. But a narrow stone ledge ran along the face of the building, toward a balcony perhaps 15 feet off. And 15 feet of ledge was not nothing, and nothing at all was exactly what waited behind that breaking door. The door cracked again. A voice on the other side. She's gone out the window, so she went out the window. The night air struck her like a plunge into cold water. The wind dragged at her skirts, wanting to peel her off the stone and feed her to the cobbles below. She pressed her spine flat to the wall and slid one slippered foot along the ledge, then the other, her fingers searching the rough-off face for any seam to grip. She did not look down. Looking down was how the slow ones died, and she had not survived this far to die slow now. Halfway across, her foot found a patch of frost. It slid. For one endless, weightless instant the world let go of her entirely, and she felt her body begin its slow turn toward the drop. Her nails tore against the stone, caught the carved lip of a molding. Held, she hung there, her heart in her teeth, the letter still against her ribs, and she heard, very far away inside her own skull, a dead woman's handwriting. "Be braver than I was." So she pulled herself flat to the wall again, and breathed once and kept moving, even with her fingertips leaving small dark prints of blood on the pale stone. She reached the balcony and hauled herself over the rail, just as a hand shot out the study window behind her and snatched at the trailing silk of her gown. The fabric tore away in his fist, but she was over. She was safe. She was against the firm expectation of every man who had ever weighed her at auction, alive and free, and still holding a dead woman's truth in her own two bleeding hands. The balcony doors opened onto Sebastian, his mask gone, his face stark with a terror that broke into something else entirely the moment he saw her, and behind him a knot of Sayes men and two officials of the watch. Eleanor. She fell through the doors into the room, gasping, shaking now that there was finally room to shake. Thorne's men. "They tried to take me." The fire was his answer when the lie wouldn't hold. "I know. We took two of them below stairs." He had his coat around her trembling shoulders before she'd finished. The fire's small, contained to the one room. But in the smoke Thorne ran, out a servant's door. "We can give chase." "Let him run." Eleanor straightened, drawing the coat close, the letter solid against her ribs. "He set a fire in a crowded house in front of 200 witnesses, after publicly accusing you of a crime he invented out of air. He's done your work for you tonight." Every name that matters watched him do it. An official stepped near, grave, half his finery singed. "Your Grace, we've Subra house. The flames are out, but Lord Thorne has handed us the rope," Eleanor said, before Sebastian could answer for her. Between this letter, the Duke's ledgers, and what every soul in that ballroom witnessed, Marcus Thorne will answer in a courtroom he cannot buy. "See the charges filed by morning." The man looked at her. At the torn gown, the bleeding fingertips, the steadiness underneath all of it, and he bowed, lower than he had to. "By morning, Your Grace." What followed took the law 6 weeks to assemble and 1 long afternoon to deliver, and Eleanor sat in the gallery for every hour of it, because she would not let it be done for her. Sebastian's ledgers built the frame. Every bribed official and forged contract and human cargo dressed up as honest labor. The girls sold abroad under false papers he had thought buried too deep to ever surface. But it was Eleanor who had found the keystone, and Eleanor who had spent 3 weeks coaxing Agnes Pruett up, out of a riverside room and into that courtroom. The half-blind old maid stood at last before a magistrate Thorne could not own and said, in a dry, steady, unbreakable voice, what she had laundered and what she had seen, and what her dying mistress had begged her to remember, and it was Catherine's own letter, read aloud into the silence of that court, dated and detailed and undeniable, that snapped the last of Thorne's purchased protection like a rotten thread. 5 years she had waited for a spine. She had found one at last, in a girl who had run down the same kind of alley, and refused, this time, to keep running. Marcus Thorne went to prison stripped of his name, his fortune frozen, his powerful friends scattering like rats off a holed ship. They led him out past the gallery, And he turned once and found Eleanor's face in the crowd and opened his mouth to spend one last cruelty on her. She held his gaze and said nothing at all, because she had finally learned the only answer such a man ever earns: the silence of a person who has stopped being afraid of the dark, looking down at the thing that taught her the fear, and finding it so much smaller than she had spent her whole life believing. He shut his mouth, and then he was gone, and the door closed on him, and that was the end of Lord Marcus Thorne. The morning after the verdict, Eleanor found a small box on her bedside table. Inside, on dark velvet, lay a ring, heavy gold, set with a deep ruby. The wolf and the thorns worked fine into the band. The signet of the Duchess of Ravenscar. The true one, not the role she had been playing. She found him in his study, the same room where she had once set a dead girl's truth on his desk and called herself his equal. "The ring," she said, holding up the box. He looked up, and for once the man all London had feared seemed almost unsure of himself. "It belongs to the Duchess of Ravenscar, the real one. Not the part you've worn these months." He set down his pen, somewhere between the ash in that grate and watching. "You walk a ledge 3 stories above open stone. I stop pretending, Eleanor. I want you here. Not as a weapon against Thorne. Not as a debt I've just to forgive. Because you turned the coldest house in England into the only place I have wanted to come home to in 5 years." Her throat tightened. "I want to stay. Truly stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have somewhere now. I built it myself in a cold room over a shop in Camden with these 2 hands." She crossed the room to him. "I want to stay because I choose you. Because choosing is a thing I am finally allowed to do." He stood, came round the desk, and took her bandaged hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture so gentle it did not match a single rumor anyone had ever told of him. "Then it's yours," he said, "if you'll have it." She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had only been waiting. She held her hand up to the morning light and watched the ruby take fire. "How do I look?" she asked. His rare true smile broke across his ruined face and remade it entirely. "Like a woman who saved herself," he said, "and decided to let me come along for the rest of it. Now, before you go, stay with me one moment longer, because this is the part that matters most, and it is not the ring, and it is not the kiss. Think back to what you were told about Sebastian Hargrove before you ever met him. A monster. A man mothers used to frighten their children. Quiet. A face full of scars and a heart to match every one of them. The whole city agreed on it. The whole city was certain. And the city was wrong, because not one of them ever troubled to ask the single simplest question: what gave him those scars? They say saw the wound, and they wrote the man from it. They read the cover, and never once turned the page. How many people have you done that to? Be honest, just with yourself, just for the length of this breath. The neighbor everyone warned you about. The man at the end of the bar with the hard, closed face. The relative the family decided long ago was difficult and never reconsidered. We are so quick, all of us, to take a reputation handed to us by people who never bothered to check it themselves, and to carry it around like it's the truth. Because carrying it is easier than asking. Because asking costs us the warm comfort of being certain. And think about Eleanor. A girl bought and sold and bargained over so many times she had come to believe, somewhere deep down where belief lives, that small and quiet and grateful was the most she could ever hope to be. The lesson of her story is not that a powerful man rode in and rescued her. He did not. Look again at what actually happened. He opened a door. She was the one who walked out of it on bleeding feet, earned her own bread among strangers, dug up her own father's shame and looked at it square, found the one witness the law had given up on, and walked back in not as a rescued thing, but as an equal who had chosen the fight. There is a whole world of difference between being saved and saving yourself. And most of us spend our lives waiting for the first, when it was always the second that would have set us free. And think of Catherine Ellis, who waited 5 years under a floorboard for someone brave enough to read her words. 5 years because everyone who knew the truth was too comfortable, too frightened, too certain that one woman's word could never weigh anything against a powerful man's reputation. Maybe that is the hardest lesson buried in all of this. Your voice is worth more than the people who profit from your silence will ever let you believe. The dead girl was right to write it down. The living woman was right to read it aloud. And the world tilted, finally, on its axis, because two ordinary people refused to look away from what was easier left unseen. So, here is what I will leave you holding tonight. The people we are quickest to call monsters are so often only people no one ever gave the chance to be human. And the people we are quickest to pity as helpless are so often only people no one ever told were strong. We get both of them wrong, all the time, every single day, and the cost of getting them wrong is measured out in girls married to men who frighten them, and good men dying, alone, behind a face nobody ever questioned. How many good men have we buried under a reputation for we never once bothered to check? And how many strong women have we shrunk down into victims, simply because pitying them was easier than standing back and watching them win? I would like to hear from you. Have you ever been judged for the surface of a thing, the scar, the rumor, the worst day someone happened to catch you on, and gone on to prove every one of them wrong? Or have you ever looked past a reputation everyone agreed was true, and found a whole person worth knowing underneath it? Tell me about it down in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight, because I read every single one of them. And the truth is that the best part of any story has always been the people we get to share it with. Stay a while. And the next time someone hands you a monster, ready-made and easy to carry, do the harder thing. Ask what gave him his scars before you decide what he is.